Axel Hofmann, che viene da Zurigo, University Hospital of Zurich, School of Medicine, University of Western Australia, Center for Population Health Research of Curtin University, Western Australia, e fondatore dell'International Foundation for Patient Blood Management e membro dell'OMS. Quindi il contenuto della relazione che ci porterà oggi e per il quale lo ringrazio è la buona gestione del sangue, ottimizzazione della gestione dell'anemia.
My affiliations, and the main one is Western Australia, which is really my hub. And here's my disclaimers. I work for governments, for public institutions, blood services, professional societies and NGOs, and also for the industry. And I'd like to start with this policy brief that has been issued by the World Health Organization in 2021. The urgent need to implement patient blood management. So obviously we have to do something that we have missed out on, otherwise it wouldn't be an urgency. This is now being translated into other languages. And I'd like to show you, first of all, what is patient blood management. Now, recently in the journal Anesthesia and Analgesia, we published the global definition of patient blood management, which is basically a patient-centered, systematic, evidence-based approach to improve patient outcomes by managing and preserving a patient's own blood. So that's important, the patient's own blood, not resorting to somebody else's blood in the first place, but managing the own blood. How? By preserving the blood volume and by managing the circulating volume in the best possible way, and also by promoting patient safety and empowerment. And I think we heard several speeches today that underline the importance of patient empowerment, informed consent, informed choice. Now, the drivers behind this were several professional societies, but meanwhile we have endorsement from a number of professional societies around the world, including the American Society of Anesthesiologists that presents about 50,000 physicians or anesthetists, Korean Society of Anesthesiologists, Society of Cardiovascular Anesthesiologists, but also hematology societies, and finally the World Health Organization. Now, how does patient blood management work? Well, number one is the detection and the management of anemia and iron deficiency. And of course, I'm not talking here to something's. You can continue. Is it okay, Olivia? Esther. Esther. Sorry. I always confuse her both names, right? Olivia and Esther, but both are beautiful first names. So again, I'm not talking as I'm not a hematologist. I'm a researcher, and I'm really talking about the broad spectrum of medicine rather than hematological malignancies. So, detection and management of anemia is something that is not done routinely, specifically in surgical patients, also not in surgical oncology patients, and in many other patient populations. The second pillar is minimizing blood loss and bleeding systematically, which applies not only anesthesiological techniques, but also hemostasiological techniques, and of course, surgical techniques. The amount of blood loss, the main predictor for the amount of blood loss is, you might guess it, is the selection of your surgeon. So, and then thirdly, leveraging and optimizing the patient-specific physiological tolerance of anemia. And you might be surprised, and I think you know it as hematologists from your own practice, how low of hemoglobins can be tolerated once a patient is adapted. So what is the magnitude of this problem of not managing the patient's own blood? Well, here is it. 2.9 billion individuals on planet Earth are suffering from either anemia or micronutrient deficiency, which is the precursor for, of course, iron deficiency anemia. And we see here two graphs. The one is showing you the anemia prevalence over the last 23 years. The red is severe, then you have moderate, and then you have mild anemia. You see that the prevalence has gone down a bit, so from somewhere 33% of our population to about 28. However, the burden of disease calculated in years lived with disability is keeping a stable high level. And let's go first to these lines down there. So anemia is the fourth largest cause worldwide for life years lived with disability, and it contributes more than 60 million YLDs. Also from a, let's say, economic perspective, very, very important to understand that anemia hampers productivity, work productivity. And for instance, India, which has a huge problem with nutritional anemia, is losing about 6% of its GDP just due to anemia, which translates in about $160 billion. And if you multiply this with the purchasing power of dollars in India, it's an enormous amount of money. But then what is really something that is totally not on the radar of most clinicians is, the last line, that we have about 100 million hospitalized patients every year that land on the operating table with anemia. And now I want to show you a very important meta-analysis by Fowler, published in the British Journal of Surgery. It includes almost 1 million surgical patients of 24 studies, and about 39% of these patients were anemic. And now the anemia was associated with a threefold increase of mortality. So anemia in surgical patients is a mortality driver. But not only that, it's a morbidity driver. We have an increase of acute kidney injury that is about 4 times as high when compared to non-anemic surgical patients. Hospital-acquired infections, which is really what I call the demons of a hospital, extremely expensive to treat, could cost between $5,000 to $35,000 per infection, is twice as high with the anemic patient. And in a subpopulation of cardiac surgery patients, we saw an increase of the stroke prevalence of about 28%. And of course, anemia is a main driver for transfusion. In fact, here in that study, it showed that the anemic patient used about 5 times as much red blood cells as the non-anemic patient. So the conclusion that you see here, it's about many patient populations, but for this audience, I just picked that one, number 4 in the policy brief. Anemia management, anemia in patients with oncological and hematological malignancies has a prevalence between 26 and 53%, and is reported to be as high as 75% in patients with solid tumors, and it's a driver, again, for morbidity and mortality. Then there are other factors. Blood loss, you might say, well, blood loss, isn't that a form of anemia? Yeah, it is. It's a chronic, it's an acute form of anemia, but it has a totally different physiological impact than a chronic anemia, of course. And then we have coagulopathy with bleeding. And these 3 factors, these are the ones that are being addressed systematically with this new concept of patient blood management. We are dealing, because every one of these is an independent predictor for adverse outcomes, again, including morbidity and mortality. And here's a very, I would say, positive statement. Although it is one of the world's biggest on greatly underestimated public health and health economic burdens that I'm presenting here, 2.9 billion anemic and micronutrient deficient, and 600 million with either acute or chronic blood loss or coagulopathy with bleeding, is largely preventable. And to prevent it, it's not rocket science. It's relatively easy, but it's not on the radar. It's not in the mindsets of most clinicians. So you might say, why do we talk about this? Shouldn't we address this with transfusion? Isn't transfusion the reason that we are all fine with accepting and tolerating as clinicians, as physicians, not only anemia, but also sometimes excessive blood loss in the operating theater, or even some episodes of coagulopathy? Well, number one, I just showed you that the A problem, like anemia, is 2.9 billion individuals. And the other problems are about 600 million. So if you want to fix this with transfusion, you need half of the mankind to give transfusions to the other half, which makes the first half anemic. So that's probably not the solution. But there's much more concern, serious concern. What you see here is work from Vic Ferraris from the United States, looking at the NESCIP database. This is the largest available patient-level database in the world. And he looked into both mortality and composite morbidity in about 940,000 patients. And you see here, but the black bars, this is mortality with 0 units of transfusion. This is mortality with 15 units. And the white bars are the composite morbidity. So you see a clear dose-dependent relationship between adverse outcome and transfusion. Well, you might say it is because the sicker patients are getting a transfusion. That would be the default answer of many. However, we know this is not the case. We know that transfusion depends dramatically on not treating A, anemia, B, like blood loss, and C, like coagulopathy. The problem is not the patient, but the treatment of the patient. And what they did in that research, they said, okay, in that database, we have other factors than transfusion that looked at outcome and mortality. In fact, they added 55 other so-called confounders into the analysis, into the regressional analysis, and found that transfusion still sticks out as the main driver for the problem of both mortality and morbidity. And therefore they caution to, or they recommend to caution even the administration of one single unit intraoperatively. Think twice before you give it. Here's a population that is not exactly in your corner as hematological specialists. However, it's the prognosis of cancer patients, colorectal cancer patients. It's a systematic review with 36 studies and 174,000 patients. And you can see that the impact of transfusion on overall survival again sticks out massively. You have a hazard ratio that is 67% lower in terms of overall survival with transfusion. Cancer-specific survival, 66% lower. Disease-free survival, 83% lower. And on the other hand, you see a steep increase of all the complications of these patients in a dependency of the transfusions given. Here's another meta-analysis, red cell transfusion in the survival in patients with cancer undergoing curative surgery with 185,000 patients. And you see again, let me move further down, mortality and relapse associated with perioperative transfusion due to cancer surgery were evaluated among participants with 123 studies, and the overall red cell transfusion was associated with an increased risk of death hazard ratio of plus 50%. So you might say, as clinicians in the era of randomized controlled trials, I know that we speak also to laypersons in this audience today. We have to make clear that the difference between the data I showed before are observational data. Now we are looking into randomized controlled data. In other words, we look into interventions sometimes placebo versus intervention under controlled clinical conditions, or we do two different interventions and compare them. And the intervention that has been done in researching around transfusion was, the last 20 years, restrictive versus liberal. And this is something that should interest you also in MDS patients. How liberal, how restrictive are we with the administration of transfusion? So there were 20 years of looking at these comparisons, and overall it showed that restrictive, given less rather than more, was also always to the benefit of the patient. But to try to put an end to this discussion, my colleagues and I undertook an overview of systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials. It's a bit complicated. It's an overview of overviews of trials. And what we did, you see here on the y-axis, 19 of such reviews, and we found that one was specifically interesting, the one by Salpeter, published in the American Journal of Medicine, where we have the restrictive group at less than 7 grams of hemoglobin, and the liberal with more than 9.5 grams. And you see all the other studies have a big overlap, which is not really helpful for a research question. And this very one with Salpeter included 3 very famous studies from the New England Journal of Medicine in intensive care patients and also in patients with upper gastrointestinal bleeding. And the finding was that the restrictive group, in terms of mortality, did much better, at least 20% better than the liberal group. And also in the other endpoints like in-hospital mortality, pulmonary edema, bacterial infections, restrictive was absolutely in favor. And what is really sobering is the fact that the avoidance of liberal or the preference of restrictive is just the number needed to prevent 1 death was 33. So this is quite impressive. What is even more sobering is the conclusion the study authors drew by saying it would be hard to calculate how many deaths may have been caused by transfusions. So for all those who have an interest and recall their days in medical school, I just want to do a brief excursion on the flawed concept of blood transfusion. You know, there's 2 parameters. The one is oxygen delivery, DO2. This is basically what the hemoglobin carries as an oxygen load. And then the other one is VO2. That is what the tissue actually takes up. Now, we also know that over a long period, if your hemoglobin drops, DO2 is for a long time larger than VO2. So there's a supply, a luxury. There's enough supply of oxygen. And then we have this famous point of where tissue hypoxia begins, right? Is anyone in the room who knows where tissue hypoxia begins? Do you know? We don't know. Where is the critical hemoglobin? Difficult question. I can tell you that in the capillaries, in the tissue, we never reach more than 5 to 6 grams. Physiologically impossible because one goes after the other with the red cells. So the canal, so to say. When we have, let's say, heart failure on top of it, yes, we know we reached the critical value earlier, but still we don't know the number. And if we have heart failure and anemia, we reach it even earlier. But again, we don't know where the point is. And so the next question is, and that's a very important one for you as hematologists, are transfused red cells equivalent to the endogenous red cells in terms of rheology, biochemistry, and biophysical properties? And do transfused red cells release actually oxygen to the tissue, or avert or reverse tissue hypoxia? Do you know the answer? Here's interesting work from Lena Napolitano. She is a intensive care specialist and also a trauma surgeon. And she looked at a number of studies where in different conditions with septic shock and mainly with septic patients, the amount transfused, and of course we saw after transfusion a correction of hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is a laboratory value. However, remember we just spoke about DO2 and VO2. DO2 did still increase because with the hemoglobin a little bit more oxygen is being transported, but what about the uptake? So the actual endpoint, physiologically the only interesting question, almost no uptake. And also lactate was either not measured or not increased. So sobering. And here's a little insight into physiology. This shows you the fresh red cells on day 0, and this shows you the morphology of red cells after 42-day maximum storage time. You see there's a difference, of course. And there's a lot of changes taking place over that storage time. Cytokine storms is one of these buzzwords. And this has post-transfusion impact. In fact, we are talking about an organ transplant. And when someone gets multiple transfusions, then it's multiple organ transplants. And that is an irritation of the patient's immune system. Now, in cancers, you deal already with an impaired immune system. So transfusions might be the reason why it makes a lot more noise, so to say. And you have seen the data before. I don't want to bother you too long with that slide. This is work from Yoshida and colleagues from Italy. But it looks at the beginning of the storage and looks at the so-called oxidative damage of the red cells as soon as they come into a bag to be stored. And then you have all these physiological alterations in the bag, and in the end you have increased mortality. So there's a clear mechanistic model behind all of this. And I show you here some, let's say, anecdotal evidence. This is done with a high-density light and an electron microscope under the tongue with a patient who bled to 2.8 grams of hemoglobin. The patient was alive. The patient had his cognitive function. He has an ulcer bleed. And you see the perfusion in the single cells and multiple single cell and multicell capillaries before a transfusion. And now you see the same patient with three units of red cells. And you see how the entire architecture breaks down. It comes to a standstill. There is no oxygen, no gas exchange the way you want it or want to see it. When you go back to the famous formula that every anesthetist and I think everyone in medical school learns, DO2, so the oxygen delivery, depends first of all on the cardiac output. How fast is my pump going? The faster it goes, the more powerful, the more it pumps through the system. And then you have that factor of oxygen that is hemoglobin bound and the oxygen that is basically dissolved in the plasma. And so these are the two factors. And the underlying assumption for the medical student and many physicians is that the stored hemoglobin is exactly the same thing as the patient's own hemoglobin. Am I too loud? No? I'm learning, huh? So here's the problem. That's the flaw in the concept. We are talking of two totally different qualities of blood. Banked blood from someone else, stored for 42 days, is highly dysfunctional. What it has is iron, but you can give iron other ways. So the fact that by and large in the world of medicine, we are not managing this triad, A, B, and C, the way we could and should, leads to about 50 million transfused patients every year with about 272 million units. Every blood banker, every head of a blood bank is very familiar with these so-called deterministic transfusion risk, which is, for instance, the wrong blood type to a patient, or iron overload, or anaphylactic shock, or whatever. These are clear deterministic. You can say, okay, you gave the transfusion, there's a root cause analysis, you know this was the problem. But now with this huge body of evidence, we see about the clinical impact, both observational studies and randomized controlled trials. We see now also probabilistic risks. If you look at transfusion the same way we would look at a drug, then we would have a black box warning. So we have identified basically 4 risk factors. The 4th is almost as a consequence of the missed first 3. And therefore we have to say, here is a massive patient safety gap worldwide. And this is about patient blood management to close that safety gap as soon as we can. And the only answer to kill that monster is in fact the application of the 3 pillars. Optimizing the patient's own red cell mass. I know this is the challenge per se in MDS patients, no doubt about it, but we have heard about new molecules. We have discussed briefly luspatercept. We know that we probably should think of even more restrictive administration of blood and other factors. This is why we have an urgent need to change. And I want to come almost to an end with the wins. We had the largest PBM program ever in Australia with 605,000 patients in this part of Australia, Western Australia. And we included all emergency and elective medical and surgical patients in 4 tertiary hospitals. And what we saw as clinical outcomes, and by the way, with this program, we reduced transfusion to a level per 1,000 that is about 2/3 below that of Italy. So what did we see clinically? We saw a reduction of in-hospital mortality of 28% in that large population. We saw a reduction of hospital lengths of stay of 15%, which is 70,000 stay days. We saw a reduction of nosocomial infection of 21%, myocardial infarction and stroke of 31%. We saw a slight increase of readmissions, probably because we had more survivals in that group here. And the really good news for the hospital administrators was we saved the system at least $80 million in transfusion-related costs, not counting for the improved or for the reduced treatment cost due to less complications. So this was a template where we do not even talk about cost effectiveness. We talk about net savings. This was a real-world experiment, if you like, or a quality improvement initiative with patient blood management, where we show it reduces morbidity and mortality while it saves cost. And if you look again at the magnitude of the problem that has been in the shadow, that has not been looked at for decades, we have a very strong body of evidence supporting patient blood management. We have an exceptionally strong economic argument to do this. Now, if we have both in an equilibrium here, if they are supportive to each other, then it's absolutely an ethical obligation to start implementing PBM in institutions worldwide. And this is what the WHO wants now. Patient blood management in internal medicine, I spoke a lot about surgery. You might have seen, I'm sure you're familiar with the ESMO guidelines for chemo-induced anemia. And these very well-known colleagues, Mattia Abro, Yves Beguin, Bokemeyer, Mario Di Cato, they invited me because they felt we need to bring PBM into that arena. And so this was the first time that it was mentioned in cancer guidelines. And just recently, the 2022 European Society of Cardiology dedicated about three pages of their guidelines to patient blood management with class A1 recommendations. The summary is we can actually say patient blood management is a concept that improves outcomes for millions while saving billions. And it's a clear call for action to do this now, and I thank you for your attention.